Hello, welcome everyone. This is our Aloha I Need Out Living Conversations 156 sessions. We've been here with you 1 hour as a meantime that we spend here, sometimes a little bit less, sometimes a little bit more. And this time we're going to be talking about the discourse of the birds. Is this about the birds talking? Is this about something even more profound? How does it relate to freedom and to wholesome living? So it has to do with that. So to know that, we have Blue Heron Women with us, who is going to be giving us this teaching, this Owl Dojo investigation. And I am your presenter, Julian Katari, and the cooperator of Aloha I Need Out Living. And welcome everyone to this session of I Need Living Conversations.
So the discourse of the bird. Let's settle in for a imagination ride here.
Okay.
Imagine a sphere suspended in the depths, its contour vague within the ink black darkness, a black on black phantom so faint it may only exist in your imagination. But watch. Slowly, a thin margin of light rounds one edge of the sphere, outlining the orb's curve against the dark like a golden bow stretched taut. The light's edge is now gliding almost imperceptibly across the disk, leaving a radiance in its wake, the bright bow slowly thickening into a crescent of luminous blue. Soon other colors shape themselves with the blue as the shining frontier advances until fully half of the orb's visage is illuminated, then 3/4, and then the entire face gleams perfectly round within the fathomless steep. Although already that face feels uncentered, unbalanced. Why? Because if we look carefully, a new margin it seems is following the first, an edge of obsidian darkness sliding ever so slowly across the face, erasing its features as it spreads. And listen, a faint sound like a whisper seems to accompany the frontier of the shadow as it proceeds. Can you hear it? Maybe you need to move in closer and listen. Yes, the leading edge of the dark is indeed an audible as well as visible line, a whisper rolling slowly across the sphere like a wave, drowning its colors in the anonymity of night. When the darkness reaches the farthest bound of the sphere, another audible wave slips in at the first side and begins its own journey, illuminating the orb as it advances, releasing the blue and swirling white. The whistling sound it makes as it moves seems identical to the hush of the previous darker wave, a hypnotic, breathy music. So let's swoop in and closer still to hear. Now that moving frontier sounds like a many-layered rustling. An audible curtain woven from intertwined strands of rushing wind and watery tones, some rising and then falling, others dipping and lifting. As we drop into the sphere, its half-shadowed face expanding to fill our gaze, the rushing exuberance of this strange music pours over us. Its tangled strands now distinguishing themselves as whirring, fluted phrases and whistling rhythms, as the buzzy trills of a bird, the syncopated shriek of a hawk, the hoot of an owl, all compose a dense membrane of speech, sweeping slowly over the land. A sonic edge carrying warmth in its wake, and the audible line with sections that fall almost silent as they pass over large bodies of water, over bays and seas, then grow louder as they approach the dry terrain. The advancing line swells, and there's so many voices, each utterance with its own place and its own tonal niche in the rolling wave of discourse, within the swelling speech of the dawn as it breaks and spills the morning's light over the land. And as the wave passes and moves on, the cacophonous chorus of each place quiets down, the individual singers giving themselves over to the day and its necessary doing. So yes, we've been talking about the dawn and sunrise and sunset. Mm-hmm. To be sure, talk is still exchanged throughout the day, throughout the fields and the fragmented forests, across the treeless shanty towns and the suburban backyards. There are necessary check-ins, gossip, and even an occasional bursting into song. Yet it's far more subdued than dawn's exaltation. Only much later, as the shadows lengthen and the light thickens to yellow and honey gold on the side of houses, does the impulse begin to rise again in the throat, drawn forth slowly by the sinking sun. And so from the fences, the power lines, and the upper reaches of the trees, a soaring crowd of voices light the late afternoon air, an interlaced ebullience and earnest pleasure swelling with the precise approach of evening's edge, as though it were the very voice of that edge, which, of course, it is. So until, as dusk dims into night, the choral abundance faces into a quietude much deeper than the muted talk of the day, a cool hammock of silence slung between the soft scratching of the crickets and the far-off hoot of an owl. Such is the strange world we inhabit, an immense sphere around whose surface two long lines of birdsong are steadily sweeping, always opposite one another, two breaking waves of vocal exuberance rolling ceaselessly around our planet. And how easy it is for inherited concepts to stifle our senses. So often we assume that other animals are not conscious, that birds, for example, lack real intelligence since their brains are so much smaller than ours. We assume that intelligence is a strictly centralized phenomenon, mistaking our distinctively human form of intelligence for intelligence itself as the only source of intelligence or form. An expanding complex of technologies now mediate between our body and the earthly elements directly. So we're accustomed to adjusting the switches on those technologies, using our intelligence to maneuver them to improvise our way through an indeterminate and ever-shifting material field. We spend much of our time deploying a very rarefied form of intelligence, that is, manipulating abstract symbols while our muscled body is mostly inert. So thinking for us seems to have little bearing on our carnal life, as it often seems entirely independent of our body and our bodily relation to the biosphere. If our reflections do result in a change of stance or an alteration in our actions, they seem to issue as directives from a centralized thinker or self, oddly independent of our materiality, a floating locus of awareness situated somewhere within our heads. Other animals in constant and mostly unmediate relation with their sensory surroundings think with the whole of their bodies. A nuanced creativity is necessary to orient and forage in a world of ever-changing forces. A spider sets about mending her web after it's torn by a pounding rain, adding only those strands that are necessary to patch the precise dimensions of the whole. A monkey skillfully adjusts the strength of its arboreal leaps to match the distances of the various branches that loom up one after another. Some say that such decisions are not thoughts and that the animal is not aware of the choices. Yet something is aware in the present moment, monitoring the terrain and responding accordingly. Never having separated their sentience from their sensate bodies, having little reason to sequester their intelligence in a separate region of their skull, where it might dialogue with itself only, many undomesticated animals, when awake, move in a fairly constant dialogue, not with themselves, but with their surroundings. And we humans move in a constant dialogue with ourselves and no dialogue with our surroundings. Here it is not an isolated mind, but rather the sensate muscled body itself that is doing the thinking. Its diverse senses and its flexing limbs playing off one another as it feels out fresh solutions to problems posed, adjusting old habits and ancestral patterns to present circumstances. This kind of disturbed sentience, this intelligence in the limbs, is especially keen in birds of flight. A soaring bird constantly adjusts minute muscles in its wings to navigate an omnidimensional plenum of currents and interference patterns that alter from moment to moment, an unseeable flux compounded of gusting winds and whirling eddies, of blasts and updrafts and sudden calms, of storm fronts, temperature gradients, and countless other things that might impinge on their feathered trajectory. In order to stay aloft and on course, tactile and kinesthetic sensations registering changes in the enfolding currents must translate instantly into muscular adjustments, diverse sinews flexing and extending to counter such perturbations, even as those currents keep shifting in a dynamic rolling exchange between your wing muscles and the rushing muscle of the wind itself. It's a brilliance we're ill-equipped to notice if we associate smartness only with our very centralized style of cogitation. When we disparage the intelligence of birds or the size of their brains, we miss that flight itself is a kind of thinking, a gliding within the mind, a grace that we humans rarely attain in our contemplations. And maybe that's why we're so ready to call them stupid, because we can't attain what they do.
Yeah.
Of course, we humans also think with our muscled limbs, less elaborately than the wingeds, the flyers, but still our legs steadily adjust their stride to match the steepness of the slope, our ankles flexing to meet the exposed roots and jumbled rocks as we walk. We've learned to ignore the corporeal decision-making that underlies our abstract reflections. We've learned to associate thought only with verbal cogitations coursing within our heads, and so have taken ourselves out of rapport with the other beings around us. As soon as we call our errant spirit back home to its senses, our animal organism awakens from its basic slumber, and then we can hear the different phrases of the discourse of the birds. There are 5 basic phrases in the vocabulary of most perching birds. These are the song itself, the companion call, the begging to the male the begging cries, and the male to male aggression calls, and then the alarm call that says danger is around. The song, a melodic string of tones and trills heard especially in spring and summer, is often particular to the male of the species. The song is a prime way of attracting females as well as a way of claiming one's space. The companion call is uttered commonly by both the male and the female of a mate-up pair. It seems to be a way of staying in close touch. Auditory contact, a kind of checking in with each other. The begging calls, usually heard in late spring or early summer, are made by fledglings calling for food. Aggression calls arise when a male songbird flies into the territory of another male from the same species. And then the alarm call is uttered whenever danger is sensed. Since many songbirds are ground feeders, they fly upward into the trees when they hear the alarm, usually alighting on a branch just high enough to be out of the reach of harm's way. And as we begin to tune in, there's maybe an eeriness that dawns when we realize that most other animals are also listening closely to the discourse of the birds and have been doing so their whole lives. By familiarizing ourselves with the most basic terms of their language, we avail ourselves of a detailed outlet for the news that is already relied upon by numerous creatures. Perhaps for this reason, the sacred language regularly attributed by tribal people to their most powerful shamans is often referred to as the language of the birds.
Wow. Okay. So there wasn't about the birds, really. Okay. Wow.
A keen attunement to the vocal discourse of the feathered folks has been a necessary survival skill for almost every indigenous community, especially for the hunters and the intermediaries, the medicine men and women, who tend the porous boundary between the human and the more than human worlds. The feathered ones have long been crucial allies for our kind. Watching them swoop and glide and carve their way through the air surely ignited many of our human aspirations toward freedom and flight. Their bewildering array of colors and chromatic patterns probably provoked many of our earliest acts of self-adornment, while their feathers figured prominently in human rituals and dances, frequently influenced by avian courtship displays. Numerous hunting and gathering cultures have honored birds as emissaries from a more expansive field of intelligence. But with the rise of sedentary civilization and its written down scriptures, intelligence was gradually banished from the surrounding world and sequestered within our single species. The songs of birds, utterances at the origin of human language, release us from the bounds of our own speech as their winged forms, watched intently sometimes, release us from the grips of the ground. Birds have long been our chaperones to the heights as well as emissaries from there. Rays of sun, taken solid form. So with that, we'll move on to talking about animism and the alphabet. So how did we move from animism, from the language of the birds, to the alphabet?
Okay.
The question regarding the origins of the ecological crisis or of modern civilization's evident disregard for the needs of the natural world has provoked various responses from philosophers and many others. There are those who suggest that a generally exploitative relation to the rest of nature is just simply being human. And so our human species has been at war with other organisms on the earth for as long as since patriarchy has taken over.
Mm-hmm.
And I just had this conversation with someone last night about the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Others have come to realize that long-established indigenous cultures display a marked solidarity with the lands that they inhabit, as well as a basic respect or even reverence for the other species that inhabit those lands. So, such cultures seem to have maintained relatively homeostatic or equilibrial relation with their local ecologies for vast periods of time, deriving the necessary sustenance from the land itself without seriously disrupting the ability of the earth to replenish herself. The fecundity and flourishing diversity of the North American continent led the earliest European settlers to speak of the terrain as primeval and unsettled wilderness. Yet this continent had been continuously inhabited by human cultures for at least 10,000 years at that point. That indigenous peoples can have gathered, hunted, and fished and settled these lands for such a tremendous span of time without severely degrading the continent's wild integrity readily confounds the notion that humans are innately bound to ravage their surroundings. That philosophy comes from the space of greed and competition for the benefit of my personal legacy to leave for my kids that we know so well, while the other comes from a space of creativity for the benefit of the next 7 generations. In a few centuries of European Christian settlement, much of the native abundance of this continent has been lost, its broad animal populations decimated, its many-voiced forests overcut, and its prairies overgrazed, its rich soils depleted, its tumbling clear waters now undrinkable. European civilization's neglect of the natural world and its needs has clearly been encouraged by a style of awareness that disparages sensorial reality, denigrating the visible and tangible order of things on behalf of some absolute source assumed to exist entirely beyond or outside of the bodily world. Most philosophers seem to have brought the blame to the ancient Hebrews and the Greeks. In every respect, these two traditions, each originating out of its own specific antecedents, and then in its own terrain and time, were vastly different. In one respect, they were both the same from the start, the same as they were both profoundly informed by writing. Indeed, they both made use of the strange and potent technology which we have come to call the alphabet. Writing, like human language, is engendered not only within the community, the human community, it's between the human community and the animate landscape, born of the interplay and contact between the human and the more than human world. The earthly terrain in which we find ourselves and upon which we depend for all our nourishment is shot through with suggestive scrawls and traces, from the sinuous calligraphy of rivers winding across the land, inscribing arroyos and canyons into the parched earth of the desert, to the black slash burns by lightning into the trunk of an old tree. The swooping flight of birds is a kind of cursive script written on the wind, and it is this script that was studied by the ancient augurs, who could therein read the future, the shamans. Leaf miner insects make strange hieroglyphic tabloids of the leaves they consume. Wolves urinate on specific stumps and stones to mark their territory, and today you read these printed words as tribal hunters once read the tracks of deer, moose, and bear printed in the soil of the forest floor. So the letters we now read are hardly different from the footprints of the prey left in the snow. Our first writing clearly then was our own tracks, our own footprints, our own handprints in mud or ash pressed upon rock. Later, perhaps, we found that by copying the distinctive prints and scratches made by other animals, we could gain a new power. Here was a method of identifying with the other animal, taking on its expressive magic in order to learn of its whereabouts, to draw it near, to make it appear. Perhaps by multiplying their images then on cavern walls, we sought to ensure that the deer itself would multiply and be bountiful in the coming season. All of early writing systems of our species remain tied to the mysteries of the more than human world. The efficacy. Hold on.
How did the hearing go?
Sorry, that was magic.
Okay. What was that?
Turning on something that was pure magic.
It's been spooky lately. It's been like things happen lately, like weird.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So the efficacy of the pictorially derived systems that we call hieroglyphs and petroglyphs entails a shift of the sensory participation away from the voices and gestures of the surrounding landscape to our own human-made images. However, the glyphs, which constitute the bulk of the ancient script, continually remind the reading body of its inheritance in a more than human field of meanings. Yet even a host of pictograms and related ideograms will not suffice for certain terms that exist in local discord. Consider the English word belief. How might we signify this term in pictographs or ideographic manner? We could say that the simple image of a bumblebee followed by a figure of a leaf would say bee leaf, right? This is called a visual pun, and it has nothing to do with the word belief itself. But when named in sequence, carry the same sound. Bee leaf, right?
Mhm.
Picture of a bee with a leaf behind it. Bee leaf. It's the same, right, as our word belief.
Alphabet magic then.
Yeah. And so such pictographic puns or rebuses came to be employed by scribes in China and in Mesoamerica, as well as the Middle East. What's Mesoamerica? The Aztecs, the Incas, the Mayas, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we say the Incans had no way of writing.
Oh, they did. It's just not phonetic writing.
So an important step was taken here with the rebus. A pictographical sign is used to directly invoke a particular sound of the human voice, like the bee with the leaf behind it, bee leaf, rather than the outward reference of the sound. The rubus, with its focus on the sound of a name rather than the thing named, inaugurated the distinct possibility of a phonetic script, one that would directly transcribe the sound of the speaking voice rather than its outward intent or meaning. So the innovation which gave rise to the alphabet was itself developed by the Semitic scribes around 1500 BCE. It consisted in recognizing that almost every syllable of their language was composed of one or more silent consonantal elements, plus an element of sound at breath, that which we call a vowel. The silent consonants provided the bodily framework or shape through which the sound at breath must flow. The original Semitic alphabet then established a character or letter for each of the consonants of the language. The vowels, the sound breath that must be added to the written consonants in order to make them come alive and to speak, had to be chosen by the reader, who would vary the sound at breath according to the written context. By this innovation, the alphabet was greatly able to reduce the necessary number of characters for a written script to just 22. With the advent of the alphabet, a new distance opens between human culture and the rest of nature. To be sure, pictographic and ideographic writing already involved a displacement of our sensory participation from the depths of the animate environment to the flat surface of our walls of clay tablets or a sheet of papyrus. However, the pictographic glyphs still referred implicitly to the animate phenomenon of which it was a static image. It was that worldly phenomenon in turn that provoked from us the sound of its name. The sensible phenomenon and its spoken name were, in a sense, still participant with one another. The name a sort of emanation of the sensible entity. With the phonetic alphabet, however, the written character no longer refers to any sensible phenomenon out in the world, or even to the name of such a phenomenon, but solely to the gesture made by the human mouth. There is a concerted shift of attention away from any outward or worldly reference of the pictorial image, away from the sensible phenomenon that had previously called forth the spoken utterance, to the shape of the utterance itself, now invoked directly by the written character. A direct association is established between the pictorial sign and the vocal gesture for the first time, completely bypassing the thing pictured. The evocative phenomena, the entities imaged, are no longer a necessary part of the equation. Human utterances are now elicited directly by human-made signs. The larger, more than human life world is no longer part of the picture, no longer a necessary part of the system. It was only, however, with the transfer of phonetic writing to Greece and the consequent transformation of the Semitic alphabet into the Greek alphabet that the progressive abstraction of linguistic meaning from the enveloping life world now reached a type of completion. While the Semitic names had older non-grammatological meanings for those who spoke a Semitic tongue, the Greek version of those names had no non-grammatological meaning whatsoever for the Greeks. That is, while the Semitic name for the letter was also the name of a sensorial entity commonly imaged by or associated with the letter, the Greek name had no sensorial reference at all. And so the indebtedness of human language to the more than human perceptual field, an indebtedness preserved in the names and shapes of the Semitic letters, could now be entirely forgotten. The scribe or author could now begin to dialogue with his or her own visible inscriptions, viewing and responding to his or her own words, even as he or she wrote them down. So a new power of reflexivity was coming into existence, born by the relation between the scribe and his or her scripted text. The letters and the written words that they present are not subject to the flux of growth and decay, to the perturbations and the cyclical changes common to other visible things. They seem to hover, as it were, in another strangely timeless dimension. Alphabetic writings deflect our attention from its visible aspect, effectively vanishing behind the current of human speech that it provokes. The process of learning to read and write with the alphabet engenders a new, profoundly reflexive sense of self. The capacity to view and even dialogue with one's own words after writing them down, or even in the process of writing them down, enables a new sense of autonomy and independence from others, and even from the sensuous surroundings that had earlier been one's conversational partner. In Egyptian myth, we have a king saying, "If men learn to read and write, it will implant forgetfulness in their souls. They will cease to exercise memory because they rely on that which is written, calling things to remembrance, no longer from within themselves, but by the means of external marks." That's pretty profound.
Mm-hmm.
If men learn to read and write, it will implant forgetfulness in their souls. They will cease to exercise memory because they rely on that which is written, calling things into remembrance no longer from within themselves, but by means of external marks.
That's something I've always kind of wanted to practice, where I do not write things down because I really want to write them in my head, and I avoid writing things down because I know that if I write it down, But then for some things, it's kind of practical to write it down, I guess,
Yeah,
because you're not going to remember
right.
everything.
But because we have to learn a whole new way, right?
Mm.
So in indigenous oral cultures, nature itself is articulate. It speaks. There is no element of the landscape that is definitively void of expressive resonance and power. Any movement may be a gesture. Any sound may be a voice, a meaningful utterance. So to directly perceive any phenomenon is to enter into relation with it, to feel oneself in a living interaction with another being. So the indigenous oral cultures passed everything down the generations by stories. Stories like rhyme, poems, or songs readily incorporate themselves into our felt experience. The shifts of action echo and resonate with our own encounters in hearing or telling the story. We vicariously live it, and the travails of its characters embed themselves into our own flesh. The more lively the story, the more vital or stirring the encounters within it, the more readily we incorporate it into ourselves. If the story carries knowledge about a particular plant or natural element, then that entity will often be cast, like all of the other characters, in a fully animate form, capable of a person, like adventures and experience, susceptible to the kinds of setbacks or difficulties that we know from our own lives. In this manner, the character or personality of a medicinal plant will be easily remembered, and the precise steps in its preparation will be evident from the sequence of events in the very legend one chants while preparing it. By invoking a dimension or time when all entities were in human form, or when humans were in the shape of other animals and plants, these stories affirm human kinship with the multiple forms of the surrounding terrain. So they indicate the respectful mutual relations that must be maintained with natural phenomena, the reciprocity that must be practiced in relation to other animals, plants, and the land itself in order to ensure one's own health and to preserve the well-being of the human community. Our experiencing bodies are not a self-enclosed object, but an open, complete entity. This openness is evident in the arrangement of our senses. We have multiple ways of encountering and exploring the world. We listen with our ears, touch with our skin, see with our eyes, taste with our tongue, smell with our nose. And all of these various powers or pathways open continually outward from our perceiving body, like different paths diverging from a forest. This interplay of our different senses is what enables the chiasm between our body and the earth, the reciprocal participation between our own flesh and the encompassing flesh of a world that we all commonly call perception. Phonetic reading makes use of a particular sensory conjunction, that between seeing and hearing. This is called synesthesia, and among the various synesthesias that are common to the human body, the confluence or chiasm between seeing and hearing is particularly acute, because eyesight and hearing are the two distant senses of our human organism. In contrast to touch and proprioception, which is our inner body sensations, and unlike the chemical senses of taste and smell, seeing and hearing regularly place us in contact with things and events, unfolding at a substantial distance between our own visible, audible body and the event. So the synesthesia between the human eyes and ears is especially concentrated in our relation to other animals. Yet our eyes and ears are drawn together not only by animals, but by numerous other phenomena within the landscape. And strangely, when these two senses converge, we may suddenly feel ourselves in relation with another expressive power, another center of experience. So to learn to read is to enter into a profound participation or chiasm with the inked marks on the page. In learning to read, we must break the spontaneous participation of our eyes and ears in the surrounding terrain in order to recouple those senses on the flat surface of a page. As a Zuni elder focuses her eyes on a cactus and hears the cactus begin to speak, so we focus our eyes upon those printed marks and immediately hear voices. We hear spoken words, witness strange scenes or visions, even experience other lives. As non-human animals and plants and even rivers once spoke to our tribal ancestors, so the inert letters on the page now speak to us. This is a form of animism that we take for granted, yet it is animism, as mysterious as a talking stone. And indeed, it is only when a culture shifts its participation to these printed letters that the stones fall silent. Only as our senses transfer their animating magic to the written word do the trees become mute and the other animals become dumb. So am I suggesting we need to go back? No, we can't. We can never go back. What we can do is bring forward the remembrance of learning how to do both.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's pretty profound. That's almost too much to digest.
Yeah.
So much to take in. And it's great that we are practicing this orally, that we're teaching this, that you're teaching this in an oral way. And whoever comes to this information is going to come to it because they listened to it. They listened to it. Okay, wow, pretty intense. So we went from the songs of the birds to the animism and the alphabet, and where do we continue to next week?
I guess we'll continue with talking about language and how we have the landscape of language to talk about, and the real and its wonder, the time, space, and eclipse of Earth. There's with language, and then so let's keep on with language.
The landscape of language.
Yeah.
Cool. Amazing. So there's the invitation for anybody watching. The landscape of language is our next conversation. And please, I want to let people know that even though Rumble is the place where we get more views, we are in YouTube and Facebook, but I've been noticing that we are really shadow banned. Like I've noticed it. We are in Facebook and YouTube shadow banned. That's why it's so difficult to get viewers, to get likes, to get things in those platforms. And so I want to ask people, hey, if they want to get this information out, they have to manually share it, copy paste the links, etc. Because I've noticed that. But then it's a good sign. You know why? Because that means that they're bothered by this. They're not in the, this tickles down their agenda. So I guess it's a sign that we're doing the right thing. I mean, it can only be that. And otherwise, next week we sit with 6:30. Anything else you want to tell people?
We are going to have a time change between now and next week, right?
Oh yeah, for the US, yeah.
It happens on Sunday, so you and I will be at the same time. So we're going to be an hour earlier.
You want to do it an hour earlier?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So it would be then, like I just said,
Sunday, November 3rd, we fall back an hour. So we're on that normal time zone with Mexico. So it won't, sundown will no longer be at 6:30. It will be at 5:30.
Okay. So you want to do it at 6:30 or 7:30 with the new time for you?
6:30 would be the new time. It would be 7:30 as the day, right?
Okay.
We're falling back an hour, so it would take us to 6:30 instead of.
Okay, so it's to me, it sticks for at 6:30 for you, 7:30 people in the US.
No, it will be 6:30 for us also because we're changing.
Yeah, you're falling back. Yeah, 6:30 sounds. Sorry, that's so confusing. And in the rest of the world, I just discovered that this time change, like each country has their own time change. So it's a big real mess. So if anybody else is watching from somewhere else, then calculate. It's 6:30 Central Standard Time for the US. That's the time that it's going to be. Otherwise, you'll see it recorded on Rumble. And with that, anything else? No. Wish
Nope.
you waterfalls of blessings, everyone, and see you on the next conversation. And please join Aloha Ainilao Living.